That was definitely a portal April fell into at the end, and so today we're getting another Portal episode. This one is rather unique, because it's part of a 6-book series, and it's a tie-in with a Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting. The novel in question is The Ultimate Helm, written by Russ T. Howard in 1993. The story about the story. Back in the early 1970s, two guys named Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson started to develop some new rules for the fantasy war games they liked to play. Instead of representing an army, each player would represent one character, and these characters could find magic items and become more powerful as they grew in experience. Also, one of the players would be responsible for creating and presenting the challenges that the player characters would encounter, becoming a referee or dungeon master, if you will. Gygax and Arneson couldn't find a wargame company that would publish their unique rule set, so they created their own company, Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR. Now, the story of TSR is messy and complicated, but for the purposes of this story, you only need to know that the game and its rules developed over time and eventually got a second full edition in 1989. By this point, D&D had a few published campaign settings, including Greyhawk, Dragonlance, and the Forgotten Realms. However, for the start of the second edition, TSR decided to shake things up by creating a few non-traditional settings that would give players some interesting options. These new settings included Ravenloft, a horror campaign setting published in 1990 and based on the popular Ravenloft adventure modules of 1983 and 1986. Then there was Dark Sun, a post-apocalyptic desert world, more in line with the sword and sandal genre, like Conan the Barbarian. You also had Planescape, a setting that centers around the outer planes of the D&D cosmology rather than the prime material plane, where all the normal settings take place. But the setting we're looking at today expands that prime material plane in ways that no one had ever seen before. The setting is called Spelljammer, and it came out the same year as 2nd edition. Put simply, Spelljammer is a fantasy space exploration game. As such, it deliberately ignores everything we know about actual outer space and astrophysics, and instead combines a few outdated and nonsensical theories to create a very unique experience. Every solar system is contained within a massive crystal sphere that sits just beyond the outermost orbit, and stars are glowing portals or bright gemstones or what have you that stud the black crystal's surface. The exact details depend on the crystal sphere in question. And that's not all. While the default system is heliocentric with spherical planets, some systems are geocentric, while others have planets shaped like rings or spirals. Gravity in Spelljammer is a constant, so even if you're on a tiny ship or an asteroid, you'll experience 1G. On spherical planets, gravity points down towards the center, but on smaller objects, there's a plane of gravity, and up and down switch places depending on which side of the plane you're on. Also, ships, and even individuals, carry a pocket of air with them when they leave an atmosphere, and the size of this pocket is based on that object's mass. However, this air only has so much oxygen in it, and so if a voyage lasts too long, everyone on board a spaceship could suffocate. Outside of every crystal sphere is something called the phlogiston, which is named after an outdated chemical theory that developed in the 17th and 18th centuries. When you find the right currents in the phlogiston, or the flow, you can travel at interstellar speeds between crystal spheres. And incidentally, this means that player characters can travel between existing campaign settings. All they need is a spelljamming helm, a magic seat that absorbs spell slots, or in some cases hit points, and it then uses that energy to propel the ship through a crystal sphere void and through the rainbow-colored flow. In 1984, TSR started publishing novels based on their campaign settings and, in some cases, on the author's player characters. Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms were by far the most popular book lines, but by 1989, TSR got in the habit of releasing at least a few books for each setting. That's how we get to the Cloakmaster cycle, a set of 6 books that explores the Spelljammer setting. The 6 books were written by 5 different authors, including game designer David Cook, Shadowrun co-creator Nigel Finley, Dragon magazine editor Roger E. Moore, and actual professional author Elaine Cunningham. Then there's the author of the last book, Russ T. Howard, which seems to be the pen name of Howard Warnham. Not sure why, since it doesn't seem like he's written much of anything else. Anyway, that's enough background for now. On to the story. The Ultimate Helm is the 6th book out of 6, so let me quickly summarize the previous 5. Teldon Moore is a poor farmer who lives on Krynn, the Dragonlance world. He's a veteran of the big war that kicked off the setting, but he personally saw no action. Then a Spelljammer ship crashes in his field, and an alien woman gives him her cloak just before she dies. Teldon discovers that he can't remove the cloak after that, so he and the sole survivor of the crash, a giant hippopotamus man named Herfin Gomja, travel to a Tinker Gnome stronghold, since the Tinker Gnomes are a spelljamming race. Once there, they get attacked by Nyogi, slavers and monsters who look like a cross between eels and spiders. Oh, and they're the creatures who caused the original ship to crash in the first place. Eventually, though, Teldon gets away on a gnomish sidewheeler. In the second book, the gnomish ship Teldon's on gets attacked by pirates, and he falls overboard, but he gets rescued by a remarkably friendly mind flayer named Estrus. Estrus identifies the cloak as an ancient artifact created by a dead race called the Juna. And after some time in space, they rescue an elven woman named Rihanna, who's on her way to Toro, the Forgotten Realms planet. They land at Evermeet, which turns out to be a major elven spelljamming port, and Teldon speaks to an Arcane, a race of giant blue humanoids who are the exclusive creators of spelljamming helms. But even the Arcane can't remove the cloak, and Rihanna turns out to be a Nyogi mole. During a climactic battle, Estrus falls overboard, and so the new captain, Aelfred, takes Teldon on as a crew member. By the third book, the two major spelljamming races, the Elves and the Skro, which is orcs spelled backwards, have heard about Teldon's cloak, and it turns out that it's an artifact that can, among other things, control a ship like a spelljamming helm, but without sacrificing life energy or spells. It also makes ships faster and more maneuverable. Now this also happens to be right around when the Second Unhuman War begins, so named because humans are basically the only race who don't care about it. Teldon almost loses the cloak when a Skro general beats him half to death, but he gets rescued and the cloak is reattached to him by a friend who also gives him an amulet that will lead him to his ultimate destination. The fourth book kicks off the treasure hunt phase of the story, and the major character for this leg is a radiant dragon who can travel freely through the void. By the fifth book, Teldon has learned that the Juna created his cloak to control the Spelljammer, and that's with a capital S. The Spelljammer is a living ship shaped like a manta ray, and it's so big that it carries a decent-sized city on its back. However, when it opened a portal to leave its home sphere, that portal was so big that the Phlogiston stuff leaked in, touched the central star, and caused an explosion so big that it broke the sphere and wiped out all life in the solar system. The book ends with Teldon having reached the broken sphere and the Spelljammer, but hot on his heels is every spacefaring race that has learned how to track Teldon's cloak. As the Ultimate Helm begins, Teldon crash lands his ship on one of the wings of the manta ray. Nothing shoots at him, it's just that their speeds are so different that his ship just shatters across the capital S Spelljammer's hull. Teldon survives though, thanks to his cloak, and he's rescued by a group of human warriors just before a band of Nyogi can capture him. Now, because the Spelljammer is big enough to host a city on its back, it has inhabitants that include every major spacefaring race. A lot of people have managed to reach the Spelljammer over the years, but it's stayed a secret this whole time because those who climb aboard are under a secret compulsion to stay on board. Now they can, however, fight each other, and nothing is stopping them from trying to kill Teldon to get the cloak. Teldon and his hosts arrange an alliance between some of the races on board, and he reunites with Quellanas, an elven woman who only appeared in the first book. Quellanus quickly betrays Teldin, something that happens basically once per book, but it's okay in this case because the reason Quellanus betrays him, and the reason that she's on the Spelljammer at all, is because the Neogi captured her and used their enslavement magic on her. Luckily that's reversible, but Teldin will have to raid the Neogi camp if he wants his also mandated love interest for the book. As Teldin gathers allies and his enemies start teaming up, some more familiar faces start appearing, including Estrus the Mind Flayer, and a half-Kender who helped him in the third book. Eventually, the Neogi team up with the Lich who lives in the tunnels under the city, tunnels that basically work like a circulatory system for the living ship. Teldin goes hunting for them, but above him, the city plunges into an all-out war. Or at least it does until the armadas tracking Teldin's cloak reach the Spelljammer. That's when the second part of that secret compulsion kicks in. While the inhabitants of the Spelljammer can normally take their own sides, when the ship itself is attacked, they are forced to man its defenses. An immense free-for-all commences, and meanwhile Teldin doesn't destroy the Lich or rescue Quellanus, but he does make it to the control chamber where he can take command of the Spelljammer. It's at this moment that his elven companion decides to betray him, because sometimes that happens more than once per book, but it is far too late for such a stabbing to do any good. Teldin becomes one with the Spelljammer, and he learns its tragic story. Not only did it accidentally destroy the sphere it came from millennia ago, but this incarnation isn't even the original. The Spelljammer goes through life cycles, with each one creating a new Spelljammer just before dying. But even so, the newborn has all the memories of the old ones that came before it. Teldin's role is to oversee the next rebirth, but he has an idea that may change things this time. First, though, Teldin uses his new powers to destroy the Lich for good and make Quellanus the captain of the next generation, a tiny manta ray ship called a Small Jammer. Teldin destroys some of the attacking ships with the Spelljammer's giant death ray, but then he sends it into the broken sphere, taking some of the flammable phlogiston along in his wake. Teldin then ignites the Spelljammer, and as it lights up the phlogiston and the phlogiston burns up all of the attacking fleets, the broken sphere uses the energy to heal the shattering and ignite a new sun at its center. Oh, and this also somehow sends Teldin and the Spelljammer into our universe. The end. The analysis. Let me just admit this right off the bat. The Cloakmaster cycle in general, and the Ultimate Helm in particular, are not great books. They're decent enough if you're just speeding through them without trying to analyze everything, but even then, you'll probably get tired of each author using betrayal like they were the first person to think of it. Now, I'll tell you why I really decided to review this book. The setting. Spelljammer is so unique and creative that I love it. They wanted high seas adventures in space without compromising their fantasy settings with science fiction, and so that's exactly what they did. Realism, cohesive physics, open space. Why have that when you could do something completely different and unexpected instead? Why not have every star encased in this crystal sphere? Why not introduce races like hippo people obsessed with gunpowder, and turn the existing races into empires like the British elves and the Prussian Scrow? And since these ships don't have to conform to the laws of physics, why not have elven ships shaped like giant butterflies, illithid ships shaped like nautiloids, and liches who fly around in goddamn step pyramids? Now, I do understand why the setting never really took off, at least not outside of a few die-hard fans. People who want to play a fantasy game want to play a fantasy game, not some weird sci-fi hybrid like Spelljammer. Well, and even if they did, Spelljammer introduces a lot of complicated rules, and if you want to have a proper campaign of it, you have to at least get a vague understanding of them. Even if you love the idea of this setting, 2nd edition D&D was cumbersome enough, even before you add 3-dimensional ship-to-ship combat. Still, today's D&D game designers certainly haven't forgotten about Spelljammer. The Neogi are a monster in the 5th edition core books, and the GIF showed up in a recent expansion, firearms and all. Hell, there may even be spelljamming ships in a future book. So there's still plenty of love out there for the setting, even if it's not popular enough to get its own book again. But more importantly for this analysis is the fact that Spelljammer follows that theme I've brought up before. It takes something old and completely twists it around to make something new. The crystal spheres in the Phlogiston are based on old, outdated cosmology theories, and Spelljammer says, well, wouldn't it be interesting to fly around through that, instead of through space as we understand it today? Spelljammer also introduces elements of swashbuckling adventure, and in the process it gives the normally good elves the sinister undertone of a colonial empire that assumes that its people are inherently superior to all others. It gives the orcs an intelligence and organization that they don't normally have, making them a serious threat to the elves. It then proceeds to throw in every even vaguely intelligent monster race, putting a new spin on each of them, and then it throws in everything else the designers could think of, because why wouldn't they? We have the entire universe at our disposal and every major campaign setting. It'd be a crime to waste them. But the setting was too crazy for some, and too rule-heavy for others, and so the 6 Cloakmaster books were the only tie-in novels the setting ever got. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a story about a civil war and the AK-47.